In the name of Allah, the Gracious, the Merciful. Dear viewers, a very good evening and Assalamu alaikum, peace be upon you all. On behalf of the organizing committee of the Bad Islam campaign, I wish you a very warm welcome to today's live talk and Q&A. My name is Kashif Akmal and I'm very excited to be your host today as we have a great lineup of speakers for you this evening. We have Dr. Marijn van Putten, and Dr. Umar Nasser will be joining us shortly, and they will be speaking this evening on the topic of the Quran and science. For those of you who understand Dutch, please do visit our website. It's www.dewareislam.nl. It's also shown on your screen, and also we're there on social media with our handle Ware Islam NL, as can also be seen on your screen. The aim of our campaign is to remove misconceptions about Islam, but also to serve as a platform for discussions and talks and to build bridges between communities and people. Moving on to today's topic, which is very much contemporary and one that I also personally find very interesting. So I hope you have your teas and coffees ready as we're in for an informative and interesting talk. We'll be discussing the compilation, the transmission, and the preservation of the Quran, as well as how Quranic texts compare with modern scientific knowledge. And as mentioned and also announced earlier, we are pleased to have two guest speakers today who will both give a talk of 20 minutes, and after that we will have a short Q&A of about 10 to 15 minutes. Please also note that a recording of this live talk will also be posted on our YouTube channel and Facebook channel afterwards. So if you're interested, you can also watch it later on if you prefer. I'll shortly introduce our two guest speakers. As I mentioned, Dr. Umar Nasser will be joining a bit later. Firstly, Dr. Marijn van Putten. He is specialized in the linguistic history of Arabic and Berber. He is currently focused on researching the linguistic features and the textual history of the Quran, and the history and development of Quranic reading traditions, focusing specifically on the reading traditions as reflected in the early Islamic vocalized manuscripts. He has also worked on the Arabic as transcriptions in non-Arabic script, such as Judeo-Arabic text and Greco and Copto-Arabic transcriptions. Besides this, he continues to work on the reconstruction of the historical morphology of Proto-Berber. Very welcome, Dr. Marijn, and we are very pleased to have you with us today here.
Thank you.
Sure. Dr. Umar Nasser will be joining us shortly as well. I'll briefly introduce him as well. Umar is a junior doctor who writes on atheism, religion, and society. He is a writer for Rational Religion, a public speaker on religion in the contemporary world. Umar has coordinated anti-radicalization event campaigns across UK universities. He was once a street magician, but has since decided that there are more than enough tricksters in the world. So a very warm welcome. I see Dr. Umar has also joined us. Welcome, Dr. Umar. Assalamu alaikum. Yeah, so we will actually move on directly to our first speaker of today, which is Dr. Marijn van Putten. Yeah, the virtual floor is yours, Dr. Marijn.
Thank you very much, and thank you for this introduction. Let me share my screen. There we go. I'll go full screen right now. So, thank you everyone for being here and listening to me talk. I will be talking about the Quran of Uthman, the beginning of the Quranic manuscript tradition in the 7th century. And this is a research I've been doing a lot, and it's a lot of fun to kind of, talk about these things and talk about this really fascinating history of the Quranic text and how it developed in this very early period. and what we can know about it, working with textual sources that we have, working with the material evidence that we have, and figure it out that way. So traditionally, it is thought that around 632, the Prophet Muhammad died, but there was no official standard text of the Quran in his time. And then it is generally said that around 632 to 4, the first caliph, Abu Bakr, has the Quran written down in some written form, and that written form ends up in the possession of Hafsa, the widow of Muhammad, who comes to own it. But even at that time, there wasn't a single standard text in that sense. There wasn't a text that everybody used and was able to open up a book, and that was the Quran. Traditionally, it is said that that only happens around the 650s when the third caliph Uthman comes into power, and he has an actual official standardization mission where he says we're going to make a standard text, and not only are we going to write down a standard text, which will from then on be the Quran, we'll also distribute it to the Islamic Empire, the nascent Islamic Empire at the time. And it's generally thought that it is distributed to at least 4 regions, that is to Medina, or it stayed in Medina. A copy was brought to Basra, one to Kufa, and one to Syria. Now, the question is, how much of that is actually true? In the 70s, especially in Western academia, there was a time of uncertainty about this. For a long time, Arabists followed this traditional narrative and basically thought, yes, the text was standardized early, etc. But in the 70s, especially John Swansborough and his famous students, Patricia Crone and Michael Cook, started casting doubt on this narrative. Sources that talk about the standardization are written at least 200 years after the events they report. Well, that's a long gap, right? How do you bridge that gap? How do you know that it's really, that it really happened the way it is being reported? And there was very little secondary evidence that it actually happened. So Wansbrough, somewhat famously, suggested that actually the Quran was only standardized 200 years later, so around the 850s. And that before standardization, there was actually a long discussion of what should and should not be in the Quran, or what should be considered Quran, what should not be considered Quran, etc. Very comparable to, say, the canonization of the Bible, which had a very long kind of chaotic initial period. So already in the 70s and the years that followed, not everyone was completely happy with this story. Wasn't sure if this was right, whether we should really be so skeptical of the sources. But very little was being done with the material evidence to try and disprove it. Now, this is where my research and a lot of recent research that has been done comes in. Because there's been a revolution of primary sources, really something that really makes us look quite differently at how we understand the history of the Quran. So these days, there are hundreds of manuscripts, all digitized, easily available through wonderful websites like corpuscoranicum.de. And we can actually study these and learn something about the texts. And therefore, we can now actually test the traditional history, how much of this is true. And how to do this is by textual criticism and figuring out, how do these texts interrelate? Are they all the same Quran? Was there a standard text? How old are they? And it became clear quite soon that whatever date we put, those 200 years are much too late. We clearly have manuscripts that are earlier than that. So clearly some form of Quran was around in written form before that. But how much of it is right? How accurate is that? That is the question. So if you start looking at early manuscripts, something that you will notice immediately is that, no, they are not all absolutely identical, but they are very, very similar. The similarities between manuscripts are really quite striking. I've taken here 2 manuscripts. One is the British Library manuscript, that's the one on the left, that's OR 2165. And on the right is the famous Birmingham fragment. And both of these contain just about the same portion of the Quran. It's one folio, it's the end of Surah Maryam and the beginning of Surah Taha. And You might wonder, okay, well, putting these two texts next to each other, how similar are they really? How many letters, are identical? How many words are identical? How close are they? The answer for this manuscript, at least, is very, very similar. So similar, in fact, that there's only one letter where these two manuscripts differ at all. Ironically, it's in the words Al-Quran, which in this manuscript on the left is written without an alif, and on the right with an alif. And that's the only difference. Everything else is letter for letter identical in these two manuscripts. And that is in no way atypical. I could have picked another page as well and would have been quite similar. And so most of the time, manuscripts, when you compare them to each other, they are mostly just different, basically only in alifs, some other stuff here and there. But incredibly similar, like extremely coherent in that sense, which really already gives an impression that there might be some truth to the idea that there was a single standardization event. Although one might wonder, was it indeed Uthman who did it? Wasn't it someone who did it later? Both of these manuscripts are really old, and probably both 7th century, which makes later a bit harder, but these are things we need to worry about and think about. So how do we go about that? Well, for textual criticism, we try to reconstruct the source text. We try to look at these texts and see, okay, what was the likely ancestor like? And that's not very hard when texts look this much alike, but nevertheless, can we show there was a single source text from which all these manuscripts in fact descend? Not just two manuscripts, these two may be very similar, but maybe there's another one out there that's totally different. Who knows? So how do we go about that? Well, how do you find a source text, or how do you prove that a text is descended from a single written copy? Well, when we are looking at manuscripts when we look at manuscripts, we try to look for evidence that they have been copied from one another, whether we can see some kind of signal that shows that. And this is very similar to, say, plagiarism tests of term papers. So, if I'm grading papers or something like that, you do something similar, or usually computers do something similar. So if you have two texts that are virtually identical or almost identical, and they look, very similar, but every now and then they have somewhat different spellings. For example, the word color could be written in two ways. Either you write it with O or you write it with OU. If you would see that every time you have a text, color is always written with O or always with OU in very specific places in a text, then you would say, well, clearly they were copied from each other very meticulously, or literally just copy pasted, which is what more typical in terms of plagiarism these days. Back in those days, we're actually writing it, and if they have the same kind of spelling variation in the same places, that suggests, well, you couldn't make that up. There's no reason for those spelling variations to exist. So two texts having those things makes them look very similar. Now let's put this into practice, not with some silly text about color. Let's look at the Quran. So here we can see, I'll just say this very quickly. Here we can see that actually the pattern isn't the same, right? So these two texts, they're almost identical, but color here is written with OU, here it's written with O, and here's written with O, and there's with OU. So these texts are not exactly the same. So it wasn't just literally copy-pasted, right? There's something going on there. They had some difference of opinion about spelling and these kinds of things. So taking that kind of concept of say, the color and color written with O or OU, we can find very similar kinds of patterns in the Quran. For example, this phrase, Ni'matullah, the grace of God, can be written in two ways. You either write it with a ta marbuta or you write it with ta maftuha. So either with this little ha form or the ta form at the end. And these two spellings both occur in the Quran. If you open up any print Quran today, you'll find these two spellings. And if you look at the distribution in print Qurans, you'll see that it's almost 50-50. So 12 times, well, it's about as close to 50-50 as you can get with an uneven number. So 12 times it is spelled with a ta marbuta, and 11 times it's written with a ta maftuha. And it's the same phrase, same pronunciation. There's absolutely no reason why these two would be different except by the whims of the scribe. So a scribe wrote one thing or wrote the other thing, and apparently both of those spellings were just acceptable, just like color and color are acceptable. Of course, there it comes down to a regional thing, whether you're British or American, but you can imagine that in an earlier phase, both of those spellings would have been acceptable. Now, what you can do is say, okay, this is what we see in modern print editions. This is apparently, a bit random. Or we can look, okay, if it's really random, if it was just up to the whims of the scribe, when was it up to the whims of the scribe? Is it when the people wrote these modern print editions, which are usually hand calligraphied? And is that just, the spelling that came out because they wrote in both ways? Or can we show that manuscripts have the same kind of spelling over and over again in the same places? And if that's the case, then you can say, well, clearly it was copied from a single thing. And at one point, those spellings were up to debate and you could do whatever. But afterwards, people very meticulously copied it over and over exactly as they saw it in the exemplar they were copying from. And that's a very important thing. So if you would see the same spellings over and over, that would suggest they really had an exemplar. They had a written text next to them and another text, a blank page that they would write down on. So what can you do? Well, what you can do is you can look at 30 different manuscripts and look for all of these locations if they occur. Many manuscripts are fragments, but we can look at the places where they do occur and compare against each other. And what do we see? Well, we see that in a print edition, which is, so I'll show this. So these are the locations in the Quran. These are different manuscripts, which I've abbreviated very quickly. So this C here, this is, say, the standard print Quran. So these are the ways that it's spelled. So, for example, in Surah Al-Ma'idah, verse 11, it is always written with a ta in this manuscript, in the standard text. And in Surah Al-Ma'idah 20, it is written with a ha. And in 14.6, it's written with a ha, 14.28 is written with a ta, right? It's a really quite a random distribution. But if we start looking at what other manuscripts do, we see, look, this manuscript, this is Q47, has, for 5.7, has a ha, just like this text, and has a ta for 5.11, just like this text, and has a ha this. And if you start looking at other manuscripts, they all write a ha. They all write a ta in 5.11. They all write a ha in 5.7. They all write a ta in 1672. They all write a ha in 2967, etc., etc. Extremely well copied. There are some exceptions. Those are the ones that I've highlighted, the blue ones over here. Sometimes you see spellings, and especially this one is quite chaotic. But all the other ones are really quite, there's only a single exception here, only a single exception here, single exception here, single exception here, there. All of these are meticulously copied. And what it shows that we see the same spelling over and over again is that all these manuscripts were meticulously copied from a written exemplar. They took a new parchment, started writing it. Then that text was taken, they took a new parchment and started writing it over and over and over and over again. All manuscripts that we have, except for one, which we'll get to later, follow this pattern. So all of them have been written from copied from a written exemplar. Early ones, I should say. Consistently the same spelling. That's what we find. Hundreds of examples where the equivalent of color is consistently spelled in the same way, in the same place in all manuscripts. This could only have happened if they all descend from a single source. Therefore, there was a single written source text, an archetype from which all the manuscripts were meticulously copied. Now, okay, so there was a single standardization effort. The text was a standard text, and it was spread over the Islamic world afterwards. Now we have to wonder, what date was that? And how do you date manuscripts? It's very difficult. Manuscripts do not contain dates most of the time. At some point they start containing dates, but they're so late that they're not actually relevant. But the earliest ones generally are not dated. But through radiocarbon dating, which is a chemical process where we can figure out how old something is that is made of organic material, and indeed Qurans are made of organic material, they're made of parchment, which is skin. We can learn something about the date of manuscripts. And well, here's one manuscript. This is one that is held at Leiden, and it was carbon dated. And it has a probability of 89.3% that it was written in between 652 and 694 AD. So the second half of the 7th century. And if we start looking at more manuscripts and more manuscripts, we have a whole bunch of them from that period, which really suggests that and they are all part of the standard texts, which really suggests that a standardization can't have happened much later than 650, which is, of course, consistent with the time frame of Uthman's standardization. Now, what else can we say? The other part of the story is that the Quran was distributed across the Islamic Empire. Well, can we show that? And with that, we need to do schematics. What are schematics? In textual criticism, we try to find out how different versions of a text relate to one another. If one text has several differences in relation to another, and then if a second text has those same differences in addition to others, then we can reconstruct the order of copying that these manuscripts have been copied. So I have three almost the same texts here, but if we start looking at what the differences are, we see first, okay, here, this one changed the spelling, color, and through, and violet was added over here. And the second one has all those changes. So color is now written with OU, through is no longer written OUGH, but with a U. And violet was added in both, but it adds even more differences. Characteristic is suddenly written with CK, and blue is misspelled with EU. Now what we can say is we can kind of reconstruct, okay, who was first, who made some changes, and who made even more changes, because it's a layered effect. And what we can say is, well, clearly this was the original text, then some changes were made, and then someone else took this text, the second text, and made even more changes, but kept all the old changes. And that way we can see a kind of interrelationship to these texts. Now we can do this to the Quran too. In medieval works, we have many reports of small differences between Qurans that they find in Medina, Kufa, Basra, and Damascus. And we indeed find these in early manuscripts. So, for example, it is reported that in Medina and Damascus there's فَإِنَّ اللَّهَ الْغَنِيُّ الْحَمِيدُ, while Kufa and Basra is فَإِنَّ اللَّهَ هُوَ الْغَنِيُّ الْحَمِيدُ. And indeed, that's exactly what we find. Here the hua is missing, here the hua is present. Two different manuscripts with two different spellings. So we can start looking at these. And this is a great paper by Michael Cook. And recently Haitham Sidki has done something very similar as well. And actually already Theodor Nordecke in the 1850s did something similar, but people mostly ignored it. He said, let's look at these variants that are reported in the literary sources, and let's see how they interrelate. And what we see is there's actually a very neat story that comes out of that. Because what we see is that there are 16 unique differences where the Damascus manuscript is different from Medina, Basra, and Kufa. Then there are 13 differences where Medina and Damascus cluster together, and Basra and Kufa cluster together. Finally, Kufa has 6 unique differences compared to Medina, Damascus, and Basra. So it's on its own against these other 3. Now, what Cook noticed, this is the same Michael Cook who in the 70s still thought that the Quran was composed maybe 200 years later, by the way. He said, we can make a stemma out of this. We can say, well, Damascus was the original manuscript. Then when it was copied, 16 differences snuck in. And once the Basran copy was copied, it was copied from the Medina copy, and it introduced another 13 differences. And then when the Kufa copy was copied from the Basra copy, another 6 were introduced. That's not the only solution to these variants. You could also say it's this, that when the Medina one was copied first, and then when Damascus was copied from the Medina one, 16 differences were introduced, while when Basra was copied from the Medina one, 13 differences were introduced. So it splits at the Medina one, and then Kufa copies from Basra. You can also do it like this, or also do it like that. But those are the only 4 options. That's the only way that it could have happened. And once we actually look at manuscripts, we see that they actually belong to these different regions. So we see that you have Medinan manuscripts, Damascene manuscripts, Basra manuscripts, Kufan manuscripts. So what does this tell us? I see I'm sort of running out of time, but I'll sneak in a couple of minutes. Material evidence really aligns nicely with the tradition. The Uthman standardized the text, and the text was standardized around Uthman's time, according to the manuscripts. The tradition tells us that copies were made and distributed across the Islamic Empire, at least probably to Medina, Damascus, Kufa, and Basra. And indeed, in the manuscript evidence, we see that 4 master copies were distributed to Medina, Damascus, Kufa, and Basra. Now, what about other text types? And this is the last bit that I want to cover. We have some reports, traditional reports, that tell us, look, there were other Qurans besides Uthman's Quran. Ibn Mas'ud had his own Quran, so these are companions of the Prophet, Ubay, Ibn Abbas, etc. And they are said to have had different orders of surahs, sometimes more surahs, sometimes fewer surahs, and sometimes different wordings in certain places. Sometimes words were ordered in a different way, sometimes you just chose a different word. And there are reports that seem to suggest that, Ibn Mas'ud's codex was still around as late as the 9th century, and people were able to actually look at it and report what it said. but where are they? For a long time, scholars were wondering, where are they? And they were skeptical, are these reports just made up? What's going on with these? So they've long been skeptical of such codices, but if they really existed, where are they? But here's something where something really changed. The Sana palimpsest was found. The Sana palimpsest, well, that's this manuscript over here. It's a beautiful manuscript, very nice. And the text that we see here is just standard Quranic text. However, there's a text below it. And the text below it is not very easy to see until you use UV light. And then it comes out. And you see a text below the text, and you see some of these traces. And if you stare really, really hard at it and look at it really, really close, you can actually figure out what your original text said. And the original text is clearly Quran. It is clearly a Quranic text. However, it is not the same text as the standard Uthmanic text. It has different wordings. It has different order of surahs. It has very similar variants to the ones that we find in these companion codices that are being reported upon. So this kind of shows that really there is something to it. There were other types of Quran, but all of those have disappeared. The Uthmanic text type became so dominant that even in this text, which technically retains it, has been robbed of, and the standard text has been written over. So there is some trace of these kind of companion codices from before standardization, or at least copies of companion codices of before standardization. So to finish off, the Quran was standardized early. That's what we can see from the manuscript evidence. Probably during the time of Uthman's caliphate, after the death of Muhammad, although technically the material evidence could also show it earlier than that. 4 copies were made of the standard text, distributed across the Islamic empire, and after that very meticulously copied. Virtually every single manuscript descends from this standard text type, this Uthmanic text type, from which was basically the basis for all manuscripts. The Sana palimpsest right now is the only known exception that we know of, but there's bound to be more at some point. With that, I would like to thank you.
Thank you very much for that talk, and I think you could talk on this topic for hours. So you did very well in summarizing that in 20 minutes. Thank you very much. I can imagine there are questions there, but I think let's save them for at the end. For now, I would like to hand it to Dr. Umar Nasir, who will be speaking on the topic of the Quran and science. The virtual floor is yours, Dr. Umar.
Assalamu alaikum, peace be upon you all. Can I check that you can hear me okay?
Yes, I can hear you okay.
Okay, and I'm going to share my screen. So let's see how this goes. I'm going to share a particular window. And I'm hoping you can see this.
Yes, we can.
And I have about 20 minutes or so. I'll take a few more. I'll take a few more, because our esteemed guest took a few more as well. And I just want to say, I can't see you guys right now because I've just got my screen. But thank you very much for that talk. That was really interesting for me as well. That was really interesting. A lot of things I haven't really fully encountered, at least not in the way that you've spoken about it. So I really appreciate that. And the topic there was about the preservation or the continuation of the written text and how we can look at that and analyze that. And I want to talk about something a little bit different but related, because if as a Muslim, I'm here as a Muslim, and the claim which I'm going to put forward is that there are verses of the Holy Quran which are indicative and strongly indicative of the divine origin of the Holy Quran, and that these can be seen through the lens of modern science. So it's quite a strong claim, and it's going to be difficult for me to prove that, whatever that means, within 20-25 minutes. But I'm going to introduce some of the arguments in favor of that, and hopefully signpost you to other work that we've done at Rational Religion, which is our platform. It's part of the UK National Outreach Department of the Ahmadiyya Muslim community. So our platform, Rational Religion, rationalreligion.co.uk, has done quite a few in-depth articles on these subjects. And I'm going to kind of very briefly summarize and talk about some of those claims. But the claim ultimately is that the verses of the Holy Quran themselves can evidence their divine origin. And you can have a text which is being preserved for 1,400 years, but ultimately that won't have an effect unless the content of that text does something, unless the content of that text can change lives, it can spiritually purify. And if God truly exists, then if he is preserving a text, as Muslims believe, over many, many, many centuries, he would also, it would make sense, preserve the spiritual power of that text. And this is what Muslims believe. We believe that not only is the text of the Holy Quran safeguarded, but actually that the spirit of the Quran is safeguarded as well. And that from time to time, God raises reformers who spiritually purify people so that they can understand the text of the Quran better and they can reach a true relationship with God. If you are a believer in God, then you have to know, you have to accept that God permitted this age of largely atheism to happen, to flourish, right? But you'd also have to believe that God would have made some kind of measures for that. And this is an age where science has been the new God, it's been the new church. And whereas people in the past looked to the divine source, to God, and to religious texts for an ultimate understanding, an ultimate meaning, an ultimate purpose, nowadays people prefer in general to derive that from science. And we have made many, many great scientific discoveries in the last few centuries, and there's been huge scientific advances. But the claim which I'm going to put forward today is that there are verses of the Holy Quran which speak about these scientific discoveries and these natural phenomena in such a way that evidences divine revelation that came down to the Holy Prophet, peace be upon him. So my claim is going to be that the Prophet Muhammad, peace be upon him, couldn't have known these things, which is recorded in the verses of the Holy Quran, and that the Holy Quran has verses of sufficient precision and accuracy, and that they correlate well enough with the actual natural phenomena that you can say, I think it's fairly ridiculous that the Holy Prophet, peace be upon him, who was an unlettered man in 7th century Arabia, would have known these things. I think actually the rational inference is that the God of the heavens and the earth is the one who revealed this. And I think that option should be on the table, because if we're going to be truly unbiased and we're going to be truly open-minded, which is what science teaches us, then you have to have different options on the table and say, well, God may exist, God may not exist, but I'm going to look at the different options and see where the evidence takes us. Now, the Holy Quran essentially opens with a very, very incredible claim, and that is that Allah says, in the name of Allah, most gracious, ever merciful, Alif Lam Mim. And commentators have advised that the real meaning of this is, I am Allah, the all-knowing, the most knowledgeable. It says, this is that perfect book. There is no doubt in it, a guidance for the righteous. And throughout the Quran, Allah always makes this claim, or very frequently, He's Al-Alim, that He is the all-knowing. And what I'm going to discuss here is how the all-knowing put verses in the Holy Quran that would help us in this age, in this atheistic age, in this age where science has largely taken over our lives, even our belief systems, to bring us back to the Holy Quran. And I'm going to do this in how many domains? I've got 3 prepped, and I think I'll only be able to do 2, cosmology and biology. And there's geology at the end, but we won't be able to go into that. And let's talk about cosmology. Let's talk about the findings of modern cosmology, which have been kind of earth-shattering, because even 120 years ago, 110 years ago, the received scientific consensus, which has been there for many centuries, is that the universe is infinite and that it has no beginning, that it is eternal, that the universe is eternal. And Einstein very famously fought on behalf of this for a period of time. And it took a priest, a Belgian priest, who was also a wizard physicist called Georges Lemaitre, and he solved Einstein's field equations. And he said, the only way I can make sense of these, essentially, is that the universe is expanding. But if you imagine a balloon which is expanding outwards, the balloon has to be blown up. So he said, what if I rewind the clock? Then if the balloon is expanding, it had to have come from a single point, a single density, an origin, right? And so he said that essentially the universe began. The universe began. Very strange, very ordinary to us, actually. But back then, it was a very strange thing to say, and Einstein didn't believe it, but the evidence kept on rolling in that there was an origin, that there was what we now know as the Big Bang, and this has been subsumed in sort of Big Bang cosmology. And that's the idea that the universe had a first moment, before which, or beyond which, the universe didn't exist. And then it continued to expand and expand. And what they believe now is that it had an initial period of expansion, and then the expansion slightly slowed down, and then it's accelerating again through a force which is termed dark energy. And I want to talk about a verse in chapter 21, which is very interesting. It says, "Do not those who disbelieve see that the heavens and the earth were a closed up mass?" Ratkan is the term used. "And then we opened them out, and we made from water every living thing." And if we have a look at this, the Quran is saying that the universe came from this Ratkan, that it would be a non-Muslim discovery, do not those who disbelieve, or that would be greatly witnessed by the non-Muslims, and also that life came from water. Now, when you look at this word, the Ratkan, it's a fairly remarkable word, because essentially the essential meaning is something which is joined up, closed up, almost like cohesive and together. And also one famous lexicon gives you the connotation of darkness. So it means essentially a closed up dark mass, which then was opened up to produce the heavens and the earth. And then the Holy Quran says that we made from water every living thing. Now, this, I think, is a fairly obvious, direct, it correlates very obviously and directly with what we've discovered in modern science, that the universe was indeed something very, very great, but it came from something very, very small, something very, very closed up. And the heavens and the earth is indicative of the universe as a whole. And it was something which become very famous in the non-Muslim world. It's something that was discovered by non-Muslims. It was literally by a Belgian priest, essentially. So he's a Christian, so he's certainly not a Muslim. And then the last part is that life came from water. And this is, again, a very, something which when we go and we have a look for new planets, we always look for water. We understand now that water is seen to be one of the key factors in the origin of life. Wherever in this universe you'll be able to find it, you're going to have water. And some people always claim that, oh, well, these things are always retrospective, and why didn't you think of this before? The answer is, well, two things. Is it's very difficult when science hasn't discovered something for your imagination even to conceive of completely different things, right? So when you're an interpreter and you're a commentator, you're always working according to the model that you have, and you'll be kind of trying to shoehorn things. But when things kind of open up and you understand things and you see that things could be another way, then you can see that actually the verse was talking very directly about this. The second thing, actually, though, is that this wasn't retrospective. The founder of the Ahmadiyya Muslim community very clearly derived, and this is known in writing, he said from this verse, one can see that the universe came from a very small point and it expanded outwards, and then it all kind of gushed out of that. So it isn't just a retrospective thing. And if you read the actual verses, it's very clearly talking about that. So we then have to ask ourselves the question, is it plausible that the 7th century unlettered man in the Arabian desert said this by coincidence and just by chance it was correct in very specific terms? Or is there another alternative? Does this provide evidence that the Holy Quran was revealed by God? And I would say this is very clearly on the side of this is something which is being given to us by God. Now, the next thing which I want to talk about is the expansion of the universe, and that's part of Big Bang cosmology. And there's another verse which I find very, very curious. And the heaven we built with our own powers or with our own hands, and indeed we continue to be its expanders, or we go on expanding it. Okay, so the Quran here is talking about how God continues to make it vast, continues to expand it. And again, this is something very, very interesting, because the expansion of the universe, again, is something very odd. It's not obvious at all. It's actually incredibly strange that the universe is expanding. You'd never be able to derive that from common observation. But the Holy Quran is talking about it here. And it's actually a kind of a continuous, the words indicate it's a continuous action. And again, it's very strange that the universe is now only in the last 30 years through dark energy has been found to be having an accelerated expansion. So actually this is literally continuing. So again, I find this kind of a very, very interesting verse, which to me seems very difficult to interpret or even understand, why the Prophet Muhammad, peace be upon him, would have said these words and the specifics of the words actually used in Arabic. I don't have the Arabic here, but if you look into it, so let me just remove some messages coming up. Apologies. If you look into it, the verses are very, very interesting, and I'll point to an article where we go into in depth about the Arabic here. And I want to, for this cosmology bit, also talk about something which has not been confirmed and in fact is against modern science. Although people don't really know, the consensus at the moment is that probably more likely we're going to have an expansion of the universe and it's all going to kind of diffuse out and it's kind of just kind of slow down, and it's probably going to be something like a heat death where entropy just continues and rises, and then you eventually just get to a state where nothing happens. But the Holy Quran talks about something very, very different. It says, remember the day when we shall roll up the heavens like the rolling up of written scrolls by a scribe. As we began the first creation, so shall we repeat it. So this is a very interesting verse. Now, if you get a piece of paper, right, and you roll it up, you can see the rolls on the side of it. And they look like, that gives that kind of circular impression. It's very interesting that a black hole, for instance, with the angular momentum, as things are drawn into it, it has a similar, well, has almost an identical kind of visual connotation. This is obviously just a graphic artist's impression of things being sucked into a black hole. It's not a real photo. But the Quran is saying that remember the day when we shall roll up the heavens like the rolling up of written scrolls by a scribe. As we began the first creation, so shall we repeat it. So God is saying that the universe is not going to just diffuse into forever. It's going to be brought back in. It's going to be rolled up like the rolling of written scrolls by a scribe, and then it's going to be repeated. Now, I'm mentioning this because I think this is something which modern science has not discovered and has not confirmed. However, there are now starting to be whispers of the fact that if the metric of dark energy changes over time, then you can have a massive gravitational collapse, which ends the universe and the birth of a new universe over there after that. And there are various different theories that talk about that. So this is just something I'm putting in because I suspect, and I strongly believe that over the next 100 years, this is probably going to come out as being the most plausible scenario. Obviously, the end of the universe is nothing we're going to be able to empirically confirm. And if we are, we're not going to be super happy about it. And this is an article which is on our website, rationalreligion.co.uk, which goes into these verses in much, much more detail. And it compares the Egyptian myths and the Sumerian myths and all the different kind of mythology, which you could argue was kind of prevalent at the time with what the Holy Quran says. Now, I'm going to talk about a subject next, which is very close to my heart because I like sci-fi, and that's aliens. I find aliens very, very interesting. And I think it speaks to that urge that we have, which I think is actually a spiritual urge to reach out beyond this world and to reach something else and to find life outside. Now, ultimately, that can only be fulfilled in a relationship with God, I believe. But I think the kind of desire to meet aliens that humans have had, at least recently, it kind of comes from that. And, it's this old question that we all have: is there life in the universe? Now, if you look at the history of the idea, the ancient Greeks spoke about it in very loose terms. It was Democritus and the atomists who they didn't really speak about life in the same way. What they believed is that the universe, basically everything that can happen happens somewhere. So therefore, there should be life somewhere out there in this massive universe. But they didn't really talk about it in any kind of specifics. It's more of a theoretical, metaphysical consideration. And then really, you don't have that many people talking about it until the Muslim age. And you had a few Muslim authors about 1,000 years ago talking about it. And then you had H.G. Wells and you had the growth of modern sci-fi. And that kind of seems to have come after the fact that you had telescopes and you could see Mars, for instance, and they saw what they thought were canals in Mars. And then they thought, okay, maybe there's water there. Maybe there's a civilization there. And then the idea of Martians came from there. So it's a very, very modern idea, the idea of aliens. 1,400 years ago, people weren't sure what was 300,000 miles away from them in many cases, let alone on different planets. So it's very strange that the Quran explicitly, directly addresses this in more than one verse. I'm going to talk about it only from one verse here, possibly the clearest one, but there are many verses which allude to it or directly speak to it. And in this one, God says, and among his signs is the creation of the heavens and the earth, and of whatever living creatures, and the word there is darba, he has spread forth in both the heavens and the earth. And he has the power to gather them together when he pleases. So among his signs is the creation of the heavens and the earth. Okay, that's kind of understandable. And whatever living creatures, and the Arabic word here means living terrestrial creatures that are kind of land dwelling. He has spread so it's not just angels, right? Land dwelling creatures that he has spread forth in both the heavens and the earth. Now we know about the living creatures in the earth, But if God is saying that there are terrestrial creatures in the heavens, then that's very strange. And then he says this is actually a sign of his, and he has the power to gather them together when he pleases. So our witnessing of the sign of his power will be in him gathering them together, the different living creatures spread throughout the heavens. So God is essentially here telling us that we will have some form of gathering or contact with alien life. A, that there is alien life, and B, that actually we will contact them. And there's different allusions to that in the Holy Quran. Not different allusions, there's different mentions of that. So the Quran talks about how throughout the heavens that there are different earths as well. So he says he made 7 heavens and 7 earths. And 7 in Arabic can mean essentially it's indicative of a large number or an infinite number, but usually just a very, very large number. So he's made 7 heavens and 7 earths, indicates that there's more than one thing which could be called earth. There's other earth-like planets out there, and that the divine command, i.e. revelation, comes down to them. And again, the founder of the Ahmadiyya Muslim community, and this was 130 years ago, he discusses one of these verses, and he says the translation is that the dwellers of the heaven and the dwellers of the earth glorify him. And he says this is an indication that the heavenly bodies are also populated and their dwellers follow divine guidance. So this is 130 years ago or so, the Promised Messiah, the founder of the Ahmadiyya Muslim community, saying that quite matter-of-factly, and he spoke about this in other interviews as well, that that there are aliens and they receive revelation, and that life is not confined here. And again, if you consider the fact that this came down to the Prophet Muhammad, peace be upon him, 1400 years ago, it's quite strange and kind of remarkable that these kind of verses, and as I say, there's not just 1 or 2, there's about 3 or 4 at least, which I know, but there's probably more which you can take as more of a secondary interpretation. But there's a few which directly talk about aliens. Very strange. Why is the Prophet Muhammad in the 7th century talking about this? Again, I would say that this is something which is more on the side of that fact that the creator of the heavens and the creator of aliens and human life is sending down to us. And I guess the proof will only be when we meet aliens. Well, you could argue that, but I think the mere fact that it's mentioned so prominently is indicative of a divine source. That was from the Philosophy of the Teachings of Islam. And if you want to know more about this topic, we've done an in-depth kind of look at this in an article called First Contact, How the Quran Predicted Alien Life 1400 years ago, where we go through the different verses and we go through the history of the concept of alien life. I'm going to move on to biology now, the study of life, the most incredible and interesting kind of phenomenon on the planet, obviously, and I believe throughout the universe. And there is the kind of creationist caricature that religions teach, and to be fair, I guess the Bible is somewhat responsible for this, is the idea that kind of God is a potter and he kind of gets some clay together and then puts together a person and sticks on a head and blows on it, and then you have life coming from there. Well, the Holy Quran doesn't endorse that at all. One of the key attributes of God Almighty that's described in the Holy Quran is Rabbil Alameen, that he is the Rabb, which means the creator, the sustainer, and the developer. Right? That's one of his key attributes, and it has all of those meanings. So he not only creates, but he sustains, and he not only sustains, but he develops from one stage to another. So the Quran, and that's of Rabbil Alameen, which basically means all the realms, all the different domains. So that must also apply to biological life as well. But the Quran also talks about it in other terms, but I'm not going to address evolution yet. I want to talk about the origin of life. And there are many, many verses which talk about this. And it says that he began the creation of man from clay. And there's other verses which says that he created man from dry wringing clay, which is like baked pottery. And surely we have created man from dry wringing clay, which is from black mud wrought into shape. Now, firstly, that the verses very explicitly talk about the fact that it's the beginning of the creation of man. That's mentioned explicitly in the Arabic. It's the beginning of the creation of man. And other verses very clearly talk about how man has been created and fashioned and proportioned and shaped. So there's a process being described, and I'll talk about that a bit later. But the beginning is described from clay. And it's not just clay that's mentioned. It's actually specifics are given with respect to actually that it's dry wringing clay, which comes from black mud wrought into shape. Hamam masnoon. Okay, so God is actually talking about clay, which is of different forms, one hydrated, one dehydrated, one which is wet, one which is dry. And it's saying that this is key, because it's being mentioned, for the creation of man from clay. Now, and this is kind of the dry clay, and then we have kind of more wet clay. The origin of life is something which has been debated for 50, 60 years now. It's a very, very difficult problem. How do you get the first cell? And there are different aspects to it. But one of the key issues is, how do you get chemical reactions to happen in a solvent, water, and water is necessary for life. But the problem is, if it's just in the ocean, then everything that you produce immediately basically dissolves away. So you almost have to have water, but also something that the chemical constituents can stick to, having reacted and having been produced. And pretty much the key leader as the kind of base for those reactions is clay. And clay has incredible properties because at the nano layer, it has sheets of nano layers, basically, where the water can come in and then the reactions can happen. And the surface area of the actual clay that is provided is massive because they have stacked nano layers, one on top of the other. So modern research has indicated that this is probably the best candidate for being implicated in the origin of life. And not only that, and here's just so you know, I'm not literally making things up. I just got a paper which talks about this, and just the highlighted bit says that clay mineral particles on the beach undergo repeated drying and wetting, being dried at low tide and wetted at high tide. This condition would favor polymerization of the clay-associated organic molecules. And what this is talking about, what modern research is indicating, one of the major theories for the origin of life, it's not the only one, but it's certainly up there as one of the major ones, is that clay, which is repeatedly wet and dried, is what is needed in order to build up the chemical constituents that you need for the origin of life and of the first cell. And this is taken from a graphic from Scientific American, which discusses this a few years ago. And you don't need to read all of it, but essentially you can see there's a dry side, there's a wet side, and it's clays which are the key constituent. And therefore, I find it very interesting that the Holy Quran, talks about this. It talks about the origin of man coming from clay and water, and we know that actually, and not just that, but actually that it came from dry and wet clay, and it omits the kinds of things that the Bible talks about, which is more of a kind of creationist flavor, that he literally kind of put things together and then breathed life in it in that way. And I want to just plug here a fantastic book by the fourth caliph of the Ahmadiyya Muslim community called Revelation, Rationality, Knowledge and Truth, where he talks about this in more detail. And he was one of the pioneers of this whole strand of thinking. And I've just got two more domains to talk about, and I hope that's okay. And the next one,
sorry to interrupt, but I think we're going a bit over time. Would it be possible to wrap up in like 2 minutes, 1 or 2 minutes?
In 2 minutes, sure. I will then whiz through and we'll stop there. So we're going to talk about evolution, and what is the common conception is that I'm going to talk very fast, so I apologize. The common conception is that evolution is something which was thought up by Darwin. That's not true. It's by Darwin and Wallace, the modern form. But actually before that, it was something which was discussed quite a bit in the Muslim world. And there is a book from 1874 which discusses this, and they actually call the evolution of man from lower forms as being the Muhammadan Theory. It was a famous book by John William Draper. So the Muhammadan Theory indicates the Islamic theory, and there's a reason for that. Al-Jahiz, Rumi, the Ikhwan al-Safa, the Brethren of Purity, many scholars from 1,000 years ago, so spoke about evolution, not in detail, they didn't make a full science of it, but they spoke about it. And the reason is because it's spoken about in the Holy Quran. This is one of the clearest mentions. And God says, "What is the matter with you that you do not ascribe dignity to Allah? And certainly He has created you in stages, in different forms and conditions, in atwar. And Allah has raised you from the earth like the raising of vegetation." So God is saying, and the context indicates that God is saying that don't think that things happen immediately in the spiritual world, because look at the physical world. He has created you in different forms and conditions and different stages. And then it says that He has raised you from the earth like the raising of vegetation, saying that vegetation starts from a seed and grows upwards, and it takes on different characteristics as it grows over time. So have you been grown. And another verse speaks to the idea, the modern idea, that it's purely undirected natural forces, such as natural selection and random variation in genetic changes. The Quran says that, "And thy Lord creates whatever He pleases and selects. It is not for them to select. Glorified be Allah, and far is He above all that they associate with Him." So that's saying that it is not natural selection, it's not undirected forces which select, and it's not undirected forces which create. Rather, these are two hands of God which are directing life from the very lowest stage up to the very highest stage of me and you. And that gives us a question that we can end on, which is, what is our purpose? We are the process of a huge chain of evolution. Are we here to enjoy ourselves in various pastimes, or do we have a greater purpose? Does the history of life indicate that we are here for something more, that we are here even for a transcendent purpose? And I would argue, based on these verses and some others which I wasn't able to talk about, that there is evidence for the existence of God, and therefore we should investigate such claims in detail with an open mind. And if we think that actually they hold water, even if we're not convinced of them, even if we're not 100% certain, we should go down a spiritual path and experiment and be the experiment and be really scientific and say, well, if this is true, I'm going to try it for a while and see what results happen. And I believe if you do this with an open mind and an open heart, and you pray to an open conception of God, that you will have evidence in your own life that God exists, and that you'll be able to take the first few steps on your spiritual journey. So with that, thank you very much. I won't talk about embryology, but Rational Religion has a very large resource, about 25,000 words on embryology and the Holy Quran coming out, but I'll spare you that. So yes, thank you very much for this.
Thank you, Dr. Umar, and thank you both speakers for your excellent talks. I think personally, I really learned a lot. So thank you very much. Yeah, we've gone a bit over time, but I would suggest that we do take a few questions that have come in. One was a bit more practical about articles or books written by Dr. Marijn. I believe there's a website which the viewers can have a look at.
Yeah, you can go to academia.edu and look for my name, Marijn van Putten, and you'll find it. I think the link has also been shared in the chat. Most of my articles are on there. I have a forthcoming book coming out with Brill, and if all goes well, it should be published in open access somewhere next year, which will be on Quranic Arabic. So let's hope that works out.
Yeah, great. Then there was a question about whether Dr. Marijn van Putten thinks what he thinks of the claim by Christians that the Quran has been copied from the Bible.
I mean, what I answered is, look, there are clearly stories in the Quran which are in some way dependent on the Bible. There's a relation between these texts, and very often the Quran seems to assume that people know these stories. That doesn't make it a copy of the Bible, though. I mean, it's a text in and of itself, and is specifically trying to be a text of itself. So no, I wouldn't say it's a copy of the Bible. No.
Yeah. Okay. Great. There's one question. What? Maybe this one is for Dr. Umar. What does the Quran say about the shape of the Earth? Is that something you could answer, Dr. Umar?
I would just direct people to an article that we have specifically on that on rationalreligion.co.uk. Type in flat Earth, and you'll be able to find it. No, it doesn't. And I don't really know why people think it would anyway, because even in the secular world by that time, people thought everything was spherical. So even if you're not kind of a Muslim, it'd be a bit strange thing to kind of say. Obviously, some people believe in flat Earth, but
yeah, sure. Okay, thanks. Then there's a question for Dr. Marijn. What is the most fascinating verse for you?
I don't know. I have no idea what I would have to answer that. There's so many verses that are interesting for different reasons at different times, and you're staring at one for one reason, and it's fascinating for that point, and it's interesting for other stuff at other times. So I don't know.
Okay, sure. Yep. Then there's one question that has just come in about Birmingham Quran. Is it possible to find older manuscripts than the Birmingham Quran?
I would be inclined to say yes. So I'll keep this short. So the carbon dating that has been done on it gives a very, very, very early date, one that nobody, I think, in the field is completely comfortable with. And it should be dated again to make sure that it is right, because the manuscript looks a little bit later than some of the earliest ones we have, but gave an earlier date. It's around 650 is, I think, it's the latest date. So you end up with a very strange situation. It is clearly an Uthmanic text. It is clearly part of the text type, and I would want more evidence before I start believing that it's standardized earlier than Uthman's time, than just this one manuscript. There are probably manuscripts earlier than the Birmingham fragment, yes. So around 650s to early 700s, basically. So that second half of the 7th century.
Yep. All right. Great. Thank you. Let's see. I think that's the ones that we got through the live chat. If there are more questions, please feel free to post them. I suggest we go like 5 minutes over, maybe 4 more minutes. I do have some questions received through the email. Some people say that there was a written Quran in the time of Prophet Muhammad. What are your thoughts on that?
Yes. So I would say there were certainly things being written down, and there's plenty of reports. There's plenty of talks also of companions of the prophets having their own version of the Quran, but there wasn't a standard text, and these texts differed from one another. They weren't identical, but there were probably written forms of the text. Yes, even in the time that the prophet was still alive.
Okay, thank you. There's one more question through the live chat. What does Dr. Van Putten think of the revisionist theories of Professor Cringe?
I have no idea who that is.
Yeah.
so I don't have an opinion about them.
All right. Okay. There was one other question through email. Is Arabic the most sophisticated language? I don't know if you can comment on that, Dr. Marijn. Like, do you what according to you is Arabic the most sophisticated language?
No, I mean there's no way to measure sophistication of a language. Any language can express what it needs to express, and Arabic can express itself just like any other language. It's a normal language, and it's it was the language of the Prophet, and that's why it's used as a language of the Quran. It was the language of his people as well, of course. So, whether you take a divine origin for this text or not, is clearly intended to just reach the audience that it's aimed at. So no, I don't think there's any specifically special about Arabic. It's just a language, just like any other language.
Sure, thank you. Okay. Yeah, any comment you would want to make, Dr. Umar, on the questions raised? Any comment?
They also have a more event for Dr. Van Putten. I would just say, thank you for that talk. It was really good. I'm also admiring your fantastic background. I have an incredibly bare, no art, no books, nothing, just a radiator, just walked in. It's a shame. I need to improve it, but
yeah.
Okay. Thank you, gentlemen, very much for your talks today. I suggest we leave it at this for now. So thank you very much once again. I really enjoyed today's both of your talks. For the viewers at home, if you wish to stay up to date on our latest events, please do subscribe to our YouTube channel, and you can also visit our website, Dubar Islam. So with that, I would like to conclude today's event. I hope you find it insightful. Perhaps it gave you some food for thought, or maybe even have triggered you to do some further research. For now, I hope you have a nice evening, a nice weekend ahead. Take care, stay safe, and peace be on you.
Peace be upon you all.